Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Fabian, and happy International Women's Day. I am just delighted to be given this opportunity to speak to you all about something that I have a real passion for, diversity in the workplace, and for such a great cause. And really, I mean, usually they put water on the stage, but I've got my choice of wine today. So when I was a little girl, probably about 7 years old, I distinctly remember sitting down in front of my I Want to Be When I Grow Up coloring book. And I was picking my next picture to color when something struck me really odd. I was noticing that my selections seemed to be fairly limited. I could be a nurse, a homemaker, or a teacher. And those are great options. I, in fact, wanted to be a teacher for a long time. But I noticed that the boys section, as I was flipping through, they had all kinds of options. They could be an astronaut, they could be a scientist, a doctor, a police officer, a fireman. You get the picture. And so I remember this being pivotal and thinking, that just doesn't add up. Now, I was the youngest of four. I was the only girl. And I think I might have been a tomboy because my father always joked that he had 4 boys. We were all 2 years apart. My mother loved symmetry. And I thought I could do anything they could. So I ripped through the neighborhood playing cops and robbers and climbing trees. I was a holy terror on my tricycle. I remember bashing into one of our neighbors, and he was not very impressed. And I also, years later, was changing my spark plugs and wires in my car and freaking my grandfather out as he came up and saw me under the hood. I also had access to a lot of their toys. And I loved the little green army men and the hot rods and Lego and the science kits. Don't get me wrong, I loved my toys too, but we were kept in our swim lanes when it came to toys and play back then. And I loved, I say my first doll that I loved was Busy Barbie. If you guys haven't heard of her, you should Google her because she's just phenomenal. She had these little clasping hands and she could hold her briefcase. So I dressed her up and sent her to the office like my father. I don't remember the job she had, but I'm pretty sure she had position and authority over Ken and G.I. Joe. I was also very fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of strong role models in my formative years. Naturally, a lot of male role models, but I also had a lot of strong women in my life. Starting with my mother, very strong, courageous, and kind. My grandmother, hilarious and witty. I had a outspoken great aunt who was very involved in the community. And my mother-in-law, very quiet, competent, and determined, who set out across Canada in the 1940s from Saskatoon to Toronto to start her career as a lab technician. So here we are, as I entered the workforce, I entered with really no fear. I had been also exposed and stepping out of my comfort zone at an early age when my parents accepted a contract in Saudi Arabia. So there I was traveling back and forth to Riyadh and Toronto by myself at the age of 17. So I enter the workforce with this high expectation, almost no fear. And I also was armed with a great support structure, not the least of which is my husband, who's always been a true partner. So I'm in the workforce, and I look back at my career, and now it all makes sense, what I love doing, what I'm drawn to. But it was anything but deliberate. And I think if I had had some guidance and coaching around my passion early on, and if maybe the road had been cleared a little bit more ahead of me, like we're trying to do for those coming up behind, maybe my path to the C-suite and to the ultimate CEO of a medium-sized global company would have been a little less bumpy. So here we are, International Women's Day 2020. As Megan said, the 20th year for this breakfast. And International Women's Day has been around in some form or another for over 100 years. Today is about celebrating the accomplishments of women, but it's also a call to action to accelerate gender diversity in the workplace and about breaking that glass ceiling. Now, 2020 makes you think of vision, forward vision, and also hindsight. So when I reflect on a lot of the progress that we've made, there's a lot for us to be proud of, a lot to celebrate. You're seeing countries make gender pay equity and the number of women serving on corporate public boards policy. And you're seeing on a regular basis very exciting news. The latest one that caught my eye was Goldman Sachs announcing that they're no longer going to IPO or take public to the stock exchange companies that have all male boards. But when you think about some of the staggering statistics that still exist, we can't take our foot off the gas pedal. There's still a lot to do. When you think about an article that was just published in the CBC this January that was looking at gender pay equity, and they were looking at just recent grads from college and university, those who had just been 1 year out in the workforce. And the study that they were referencing suggested that the gender pay gap is already at 12% 1 year out of graduation. Or when you think of the S&P 5000 group of companies, women make up 45% of that workforce, but they're only holding 11% of the highest compensation roles. Or a lot of you have probably heard this one. In the US, there are more CEOs named John than there are female CEOs in the US. So it frustrates me that the workforce that my daughters are entering today isn't materially different than the one I entered over 30 years ago. So what can we do about this? Well, I think there's quite a bit we can do, but I'm going to suggest that one of the most important things we do is concentrate on helping more women get into the ranks of leadership, into the pipeline, not just in corporate world, but outside the corporate world as well. And I'm going to suggest there's a lot of benefits of that, but a couple that are really important. And one is, I think it will impact positively the decision-making process. And I also think it'll help us with the talent issue we have. So what do I mean about the decision-making process? Well, I was recently on a panel and I was asked, what were the best and worst decisions I ever made in my career? Oh, there were no bad decisions. But when I think about that, I realized there was a theme to the decisions that stood the test of time, that had the best short and long-term outcome. And those were the decisions where I had thought about the issue from a holistic perspective, and I had thought about all of the stakeholders, those being the employees, the customers, obviously the shareholder, but also there's usually an ecosystem or a community involved. Alternatively, the ones that I didn't do that with, where I maybe made the decision in a vacuum, they didn't stand the test of time. So when you blow that out to a major political decision or a decision that is high profile that a publicly traded board has to make, and you think about the decision process they're going to go through. Now, up until recently, the board was always only beholden to the shareholder. That means every decision they made was really wrapped around the return on investment. But something really important just happened. Late last year, in August, the Business Roundtable in the US, which is an association made up of the top 200 CEOs in the US, all signed a document that changed the definition of who the board is beholden to. They changed it from shareholder to stakeholder. That means that's that broader set of constituents. And that has the potential to be monumental when it is tested. And it hasn't been tested yet in a public forum. But when you think about how well suited are these boards that are not diverse, or these leadership teams that are not diverse, how well suited are they to empathize with their stakeholders, when their stakeholders will be made up of, at least 50% of the population is women. In Canada, women are graduating with 60% of the degrees, and they have 70% of the purchasing power. So it's beholden on us to make sure that our companies are strong and that can make decisions that will empathize with the broader stakeholder. The second thing I talked about was talent. Now, here we are in some uncertain times, but just last year in Canada, the jobless rate was its lowest since the 70s, and in the US, the lowest since the 60s. This becomes even more acute when you actually consider the new knowledge workers. Now, new knowledge workers are anything to do with the digital transformation we're all seeing. They're STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. They're code writers. They're dealing with artificial intelligence. These are critical roles, and these candidates have a choice. When they go to companies, they will be drawn to companies that have the right culture, that have the right diversity, that have the right purpose. So if a company is not presenting a diverse face, they're not going to attract the right talent they need. They may be putting their organizational reputation at risk. And if they go after large business opportunities, they may find that they're not able to close those deals because a lot of these companies and corporate entities and public, are making diversity part of their selection criteria. So if I haven't convinced you enough that this is an important topic, consider the studies that say that companies with a more diverse board and a more diverse leadership outperform their competitors. So this is something that really has the potential to impact our entire economy. So what practical things can you do about this? I think it's fabulous that a lot of really large companies have D&I policies now, diversity and inclusion. They have dedicated staff in some cases, and they have sponsors across their company, and they're willing to help in the community. But let's face it, most of corporate America is made up of small and medium-sized businesses that are bombarded by disruption today, digital disruption. They're trying to keep the lights on and the doors open and just keep up with the fast pace. So how do they deal with this? Because it's important they do. Well, I've got some practical ideas, but first I think is a practical definition of diversity and inclusion. And one of the best that I found was by a company called Korn Ferry. Korn Ferry is a global recruitment and people advising firm. And they said that diversity is about the mix, and inclusion is about the behavioral changes and structural changes required to make the mix work. So when you think about that, I've got 4 practical ideas that I've used in my past at companies, and they're by no means exhaustive. But the first thing a company can do is they can make sure they're aware of the unconscious bias. Now, that you can Google it, there's all kinds of information on it. But if you're just looking at recruiting, you want to make sure that you have more than one female in your candidate pool. And that's because the statistics suggest if you only have one, the unconscious bias at play will give her almost 0% chance of being hired. Number 2, how do you make sure you expand that pool? Well, you degenderize your job postings. What do I mean by that? Well, how many of us are guilty of posting a job that has 25 must-haves? We're looking for the unicorn. And now don't worry, the guy will apply to that because he knows he'll learn on the job. But the female won't apply to that job unless she checks 70% of the boxes. The third thing you can do is not just recruiting talent, but you've got to be having, if you're growing, you need to have a bench of talent moving up the organization. So you need to have an objective means of identifying talent in your organization. One of the best ways that I've found works for any size company is a tool called the 9-Box. It's a McKinsey tool. It's available online. And what you do is you have your team plot your high potentials, and then you get together as a team and you calibrate that list. And once you've got the list you want to develop, make sure that you at least make it semi-formal, because that's what today's talent want. And then the last thing you can do as a leader of my list is you can just ask your staff. You can do a survey or a focus group, and you can just ask them what they think will move the needle on diversity. You can even do simple things like sponsor some employees coming to an event like this, or have a breakfast club where you just have a couple speakers, either from the community or your company. You ask a few questions about their road to their career and stand back and watch the engagement. People just love it. So there's all kinds of ideas. As a female, these are some things that have worked for me. There are five ideas I'm going to give you. Again, by no means exhaustive. And they're all about clarity and conviction. So the first thing, I talked about this earlier, if I had thought about my passion. If you want to move ahead in your career, you need to love what you're doing. That's when you do your best work. So I would suggest making this formal and sitting down and writing down your 3 to 5 things you love to do, your strengths. And then think about companies or roles that would benefit from that. Number 2, be your own developer. Be in charge of your own development. It's been studied that women receive less formal and coaching and feedback than their male peers. Now, knowing that, you can tap into your trusted network and ask input from your trusted network. You can also have a mentor, but you should be self-reflective. If you know what your 3 greatest strengths are, what happens if you overuse those? They're at risk of being a weakness. Number 3, find your voice and don't be afraid to use it. It can be intimidating if you're in a large group and maybe you're early in career even. But you've been hired by this company to express your opinion. Use it wisely, but use it. And number 4, find your courage. Because if you want to move ahead, you're going to have to step out of your comfort zone. And anytime I've ever grown, I've had to stretch and I've scared the crap out of myself. That's what it takes. Nothing worth doing is easy. And number 5, this one's foundational. This is the one that it takes in order to make all the other ones work. And that is the power of positivity. A positive attitude is like a muscle. You have to work it. You have to be deliberate about it. And quite frankly, if you're not feeling energized by your job, how are you going to excel? If you're in a place where you feel stuck, or where your opinion isn't being valued, or the culture doesn't fit, or even worse, you're being mistreated, it's time to go. Find your courage and leave. And when you close that door, you'll be pleasantly surprised that an even better one opens. So as we close on International Women's Day 2020, let's try to make sure that we leave here with some ideas on how to accelerate diversity in the workplace. And I think there's a lot of benefits to all of us to continue to progress. The World Economic Forum said that if we don't do something material to change the pace of driving diversity in the workplace, we won't reach parity in our lifetime. Now, I'm happy to say the little girl who's sitting down in front of her I Want to Be When I Grow Up coloring book, well, who's kidding who? She's sitting down in front of an iPad, opening an app. But she's got way more choice. Our job is to make sure that when she hits the journey, that she doesn't bump into the glass ceiling. And I'll leave you with a quote from one of our lifetime's most beloved and prolific authors, Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss said, "Be who you are, say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind." Thank you very much. Have a great day.